Welcome back, everyone, to Embrace the Squiggle. I am so excited today to have my dear friend Jen Pasquale with us. And Jen is going to be one of our regulars on the podcast for the next few months now. So we are excited as we are changing up Embrace the Squiggle this year. You'll hear a bunch of things changing over the next month or so. But we are getting there and so excited to have you today, Jen, and introduce you to our audience, or I guess introduce our audience to you. So,
A little bit of both, right? Thanks, Colleen. Excited to be with you and excited to be joining the podcast.
yeah, me too. So, today is going to be about you and your business and what you've done and your coaching journey and the work that you do with teams. Uh, And so I'd love for us to start with how we usually do is tell us a little bit about you. Like, let's start with little Jen. Like, what did little Jen think she was going to be when she grew up?
I love this because the old Jen has not thought about little Jen in a while. But um, so for me, I think that, when I was thinking about kind of what did I want to be when I was little, I don't really remember up until kind of high school age. Like I was not like an 8-year-old who had it all figured out for sure. But when I was in high school, I had ideas of physical therapy, and that was the path I was going to be on. Was working as a athletic trainer for the high school, as really a volunteer. I say working; it was a volunteer thing, but it was a way to kind of engross me in that space and in that world. And I kind of fell into it and found community in it, and really, really loved it, and got into sports, and loved being on the sidelines of all the games and having like the best vantage point. And so I thought, okay, I'm going to do this. I'm going to go into physical therapy. And then that didn't happen.
When you went off to college, did you still think you were doing that? Like, is that what you started college doing? Or by then
No.
had already stepped away from that?
Yeah, so what ended up happening, and that's interesting you asked that because I don't exactly remember the timeline, but I think it was before I went to college because I feel like what happened was my senior year, I took a psychology class, and then I was like, wait a minute, I like this better. I think I'm going to go do this instead. So I'm pretty sure when I started college, I was already on a psych path. But for me, the big thing that changed that direction was not only exposure to something new, but it was also I had an opportunity in high school to do an internship. We lived in the Raleigh Durham area, so my mom knew someone at Duke who was a physical therapist, and so I shadowed them for a couple of weeks and got to sort of see behind the curtain. And that was hands down like the best thing I could have ever done, because I was like, yeah, no, I don't think so. I had only seen that sort of profession from one angle, and I don't know why it never occurred to me like, oh, you could be an athletic trainer for a sports team, and then that would feel very similar. It was like, oh no, if I do it, I'm going to go be a physical therapist for in a hospital. And when I did that for a couple of weeks, I was like, no, I don't really think this is my thing. And then I ended up in psych instead.
I love that for you. I often when I'm even coaching people in their 40s or 50s, I say the same thing. Like, you're probably not going to go do an internship when you're 50, when you're working full time. But you can get that information other ways. Like, I'm constantly talking to folks that I coach and saying, talk to 5 people who do this job before you make a decision, right? Talking to one isn't always good because that one person might either love or hate their job. And you're only going to get that one perspective. But if you can get out there and see things really quickly, if you can see something in person or you can have a really good conversation, you can start to quickly eliminate a career in a way that you can't just by reading about it online.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree. I had a really interesting opportunity. The college that I attended had a 1 month internship kind of program built into the curriculum. So every January, we call it January term or J term.
Mhm.
So every January, students would secure internships, usually in their hometown. So it was kind of a way to like extend your, holiday visit home, and stay in your hometown, use your contacts there, get an internship in something, and kind of test the water to be able to see without having to go through the whole like summer intern piece. There wasn't a lot of competition for a January term intern, so most companies were like, free labor, sure, I'm in. It was easy because it was for credit, so you couldn't be paid. And that I think was such a great program. And I saw so many of my peers go through that and think, oh, this is what I want to do. They go do it for a month and they're like, man, I'm so glad I did. I'm going to change my major. Like, that is absolutely not the right path for me. But to your point, like, particularly as we get further up in our career, we have to find other ways to get some of that data.
Yeah, so you switched to psychology, and, I was also a psych major, right? And there's so many psychology is so broad, right? There's so many places that you can take it. Did you have an idea what you thought you were going to do with it, or what
Yeah.
did you end up doing with it?
So it's interesting. I think when I went in, I thought I would do. I thought I would be a therapist. I thought, I think I went in like child or clinical or whatever the kind of subspecialty was at the time. And very quickly, I might have taken like one class in that space, and I was like, nope, that is not that is not it. Like, that's not my space. And so I think I was kind of looking for, okay, what else could I do with psychology? And I had this really interesting interaction actually with an alum. So there was an alum from my college, which was a small women's college, and she happened to be like, essentially, I thought of her as like a profiler for the FBI, but she did it for like employees. So she was on the HR side. So she would be the person like interviewing people and kind of figuring out are they a good fit for the agency or not. And I thought, man, that is the coolest. Like, it just seemed like such a cool job. And so that really piqued my interest in her background, which was industrial organizational psychology, which at the time was a thing, but not a thing. Like, it existed, but it wasn't super prevalent. So my university or my college didn't have it. But because I was at liberal arts, I could kind of design my own major, which is what I love
Mhm.
about liberal arts institutions. So I essentially was able to find that out early enough that I kind of redesigned my psychology major to be a mix of psychology, business, like organizational development, really. So they didn't have, I would have probably switched to org development at the time if they'd had it, because I really started to figure out that, okay, that's a space that interests me a lot. But they didn't have it. So I kind of made it up through my own programming and just picked the classes that I felt would give me a similar exposure, thinking I would go directly into some kind of graduate program after, which is not what I did. But my thought was it would be a good launching pad for those graduate applications.
Nice. So you get out of school, and where do you land? What's like your first job where, I always say where you're getting your own health insurance?
Oh, my first job with my own health insurance. So when I left school, I was so kind of engrossed in everything that was kind of sort of the academics of senior year. I did like an honors thesis. And so I was just knee deep in everything. And so because of that, I had no job when I graduated. I had no time to find one. And so I went to work at a department store because I didn't, I needed money. I had to, I was living at home but paying rent. And so I needed some money for that. And so that wasn't really benefits, but at least a job, that felt like an adult. And then what was cool about that is it was the place where I got exposed to the concept of kind of corporate training. So I had been working there a while, and one of my colleagues was the person in charge of all the onboarding. So when new people came in, she was the one who trained them on like the register and like all the systems that we weren't super. It was a long time ago, so the
Right.
technology was very minimal, right? But she was the one who onboarded everybody, and she was like, I think she was going out on leave. There was something happening where they needed someone to step in, and she had recommended me, which was totally out of left field. And I was like, I was kind of I think intimidated by it because I always saw myself as an introvert. I always saw myself as kind of like the quiet force. And so to
Mhm.
be in sort of front of the room and be in sort of in charge of that felt very overwhelming. But I did it a couple of times and I really, really loved it. And so then that led me into eventually through a couple of positions, going to a company that did software training, and it was really initially a corporate training position. And it was this parlay that never would have happened had someone not noticed something in me that I didn't necessarily see it, but she did. And so then it like became the beginning of this kind of long trajectory in learning and development.
I love that. Right. It's that difference between a mentor and a sponsor that we talk about often. Of the, a mentor, sure, they can kind of show you some paths, they kind of talk about it with you, they give you some ideas, but that sponsor is that person who, like, like pulls you up, pulls you along, right? Nominates you for things, says, yeah, Jen would be great for this. And study after study shows us that particularly for women to move up to the
Mhm.
C-suite, that sponsorship really is what gets us there. So I love that even at a young age, you had that person who could see that light in you, who could see those skills and strengths and abilities and said, Jen's the person for this.
Well, and the other piece of that that I always think is really, I think it's funny because I do assessments and things for organizations now. I think that's where the humor in it is for me. But in college, one of the classes I took was assessments. And so I had to write about a lot of different assessments. What's the value? I had to take them. I interned with a company doing the same thing. One of them was the strong interest inventory. And so what that did is it told me these are the different kinds of careers that you might be aligned to. And on that report, it said, like, director of HR or a corporate trainer. And I was like, what in the world is a corporate trainer? I was 20 years old. I'd never heard the term. And so, in some ways, it was this little data point that I had kind of tucked away. And then later, many years later, right, someone comes and says, hey, I think you could be a corporate trainer. And I think on some level, my willingness to make that jump was rooted in that this really random exposure that I'd had to someone else saying, hey, we think you actually could be good at this. And me being willing to just sort of trust both the assessment and this person, and kind of let both of those kind of override that instinct that I might have had to maybe play a little smaller, maybe be a little more in the background, and then be willing to kind of step out. I just, like, I don't know if that would have happened without both of those things. So I think it speaks to how much everything in our life is sort of intertwined, right? It's not any one moment. It's this one moment layered with all the other moments that came before it.
And so often, we have no idea what careers exist. And how many, right? What are the careers that are going to exist 5 years from now that didn't exist 5 years ago? I think of all the careers that AI has created. Often people are talking about the careers that AI is taking away, but AI has also created a whole another level of careers. And so my favorite was prompt engineer. It had showed up in
Yeah.
my feed. It was probably about 3 years ago. And I
Mm-hmm.
remember thinking, like, the hell is a prompt
Yeah.
engineer? And you start looking at it, literally was the people who were putting the prompts into AI and some of those different the big tool, the LLM, the
Mm-hmm.
language learning models. And yeah, those jobs, no one ever heard of them
Yep.
beforehand.
Yeah.
And
No.
so if you're never exposed to these things, which most kids, most college students are really exposed to just a very small number of careers. So who knows what you might be if you
Yep.
had access to everything.
Yep. Indeed. No, so true.
So fast forward, you end up doing that. You end up in the consulting world. You um, end up living abroad for a while. Like you have a squiggly middle of the career before you land where you are now. Talk us through a little bit of that and kind of how you got to where you are today.
Yeah. So the kind of the intro into training, or intro into corporate training, was what led me to a stint in consulting. So I worked in Big Five consulting, and moved to Dallas, moved to the big city, and kind of all the things, and loved that life, but figured out very quickly that I didn't love, well, correction, I loved the work. I didn't love the life. What I learned, after a year and a half of that is I didn't like leaving on Mondays and coming back on Thursday nights. I didn't like not having my week to be at home and to build a life and to, build a network and kind of all the things that you normally do that are really hard to do when you're on the road basically 100% of the time. So I left consulting and then spent a huge portion of my career really as a freelance learning and development. So I took that kind of exposure that I had to corporate training, leaned back on that. I had also started to do more instructional design work. So really, in some ways, I got more exposure to the whole suite that is under that learning and development umbrella, from, conceiving a program, thinking, figuring out what we need, all the way through to actually training that program. So I got to kind of see all the pieces. And so I spent a huge portion of my career doing that in a freelance capacity, which was perfect because around kind of the middle of that, I met and married a soldier who then took me to 10 different locations in 20 years. And, we moved basically every 2 years, sometimes every 1 year. So a lot of moves, a lot of kind of pivots that I had to do with what my career looked like, how much of my career could show up, what were the demands that existed on the family and on me. And so there was, some kind of applying a little bit more accelerator, a little bit more brake. And so there was a lot of years in there where it was figuring out what does that dance look like. And some of those years, to your point, were in Germany. We spent 4 years in Germany, which, I was able to work for some of it, and some of it I just enjoyed the time there. And because I had been in the freelance world, it was easy to just step back and just, enjoy for a minute, and knowing I could kind of jump back in when I was ready. So a couple of years ago, as stability became a little bit more in focus, my husband retired earlier last year. And so now we've, stable location. Everybody's sort of, we're not moving, we're not packing up. And so I can focus a little bit more on me. And that has given me over the last few years the opportunity to build kind of the business that brings the best of all of that, right? It is, I feel like I'm able to bring the things that are my favorites, like strengths work is one of the things I do with organizations. And one of the reasons I love it is because it was so impactful to me when I, got to learn my strengths and got to understand myself a little bit better. And so my passion for that is really clear and evident, and it makes it just fun for me. So I feel like I'm building the business that allows me to do the things that really bring the best of me to organizations and to leaders to help them know themselves better and then know each other better. So I do that under the Lead with Curiosity umbrella or brand.
Yeah, and you and I met at a Gallup conference 2-ish years ago now, and right again, it's that I feel like often I'm a collector of people and a collector of connections. And, you and I sat next to each other at an event. We started talking. Yes, it was a Gallup CliftonStrengths event. So we already knew we had the same lens on the world, a bit of how we like to approach things, and then realized we could do some really good work together. So it's been fun to be able to bring in other people to work together, because as a solopreneur, it can be a lonely business.
Indeed.
So it is always nice to have some of those other folks that we're able to connect with. And you use a bunch of different assessments now. So talk us through some of your favorites. So we've talked a lot about Clifton Strengths on this podcast because I find, again, it's where we both met. So it's one of those tools that we've talked about a lot, but you've used some that I think aren't quite as well known.
Yeah, perhaps so. The one, probably the most recent one that I was certified in is called Listening Intelligence, and it pairs really well with strengths, which is one of the reasons I decided to certify in it. It's been around a while. It's the history of it goes back several decades. It just wasn't necessarily, in some ways, like well marketed for a long time, and so it's got sort of new ownership, new efforts, if you will, around getting the word out about the value. And what I really latched onto with it is that the intent is to help people understand what might be that natural sort of bias that you may have in how you listen. So if we think about how all of us show up to a conversation, we might be listening for kind of big ideas. We might be listening for like, what is my role in this, in this decision or in this conversation, or what is the impact to someone else, or maybe what is the data that really like that I can hang my hat on as we're talking about this. And so if we think about meetings with organizations, a lot of times, everybody can be in the same meeting and then we leave and we have four different understandings of what was talked about and why and the importance. And what we learn through, at least through the listening intelligence work, is often we can kind of trace that back to we all heard the conversation slightly differently because we were coming to the conversation with this filter that really framed what we heard, what we tuned into, what we tuned out to, and so it helps people figure out how to be a little more balanced in that approach, and what are some good questions to ask to make sure you're kind of hitting all the buckets and you're getting a full picture of the conversation.
And you had posted, I don't know, a week or two ago about the idea of, right, it's that time of year where everybody's setting goals, it's a new year. And yeah, as you roll the goals out to your team, does your team all understand the goals in the same way, right? Does your team does everyone understand what we're actually working towards? And I saw that post, and boy, I could give 100 examples of times where teams all thought they were rowing in the same direction, or, any group thought they were all going in the same place and that they had the same idea of where they wanted to land. And that is not, it wasn't accurate, right? We all had different views of it.
Mhm.
So I think of how many ways that idea of, if we understood each other, if we were all listening the same, and not even listening the same way, because, it's the same thing with strengths, right? We're all going to get it from a different way. But, what are some of your tips to help in those situations, right? How do you help people make sure they're hearing what needs to be heard?
Yeah, I mean, I think my now with what I know, I think my default is, if you can, you know, do the assessment, understand what your listening preference or filter is going into conversations. It only takes like 10 minutes. It's not a lot of questions. It's very kind of low effort in that regard, but really high impact in terms of how they're using what you tell them to help paint a picture for what that tendency is. If that isn't a possibility, then I think it's really just being intentional with how you're communicating. So recognizing that there are lots of different ways to communicate. There's lots of different ways to listen. And I think if we go into those meetings, even talking about goals, and being able to ask the questions of how it applies to each person, to be able to ask the questions, like, what did you hear, and how do you think this applies to the whole team? Like, that's that connective part. So some of it, I think, is we can simplify it a bit by having a kind of a good arsenal of questions that are intentionally satisfying the needs of listeners in each of those areas. So just making sure that we have something to draw from, to pull folks into the conversation and help ensure everybody's getting their needs met.
Love that. I think of this, just that example of the annual goals, and a team that I was working with recently on setting their annual goals. And we came up with them for the whole team. So, right, as a team, there was a agreement that these are the four goals that as a team we are reaching this year. And then we started to look at, as individuals, like, what was going to be your contribution to that? And it was very interesting to me, because as we went through that exercise, we saw really quickly that there were giant holes in the ability to meet those goals, because
Mm-hmm.
of the four people on the team. Everyone had the thoughts about what they were going to do to get them there. But even with those four ideas, they were never going to get there,
Right.
because there were just giant holes in it. And it wasn't necessarily a listening thing. It was a goals thing. It was a combination of listening and who thought they were in charge of what, and what has to be done, and all of those pieces. But that whole getting teams to work better together is such a it's my favorite part of work, is to
Mm-hmm.
figure that piece out from a either a communication standpoint, and how do we get people to do this, and how do we communicate it. But you start to realize that half the times it's because the conversations were just never happening, right? Nobody ever said, what piece are you doing, what piece am I doing, and does this actually get us to the top goal that we're going for?
Yeah, and one of the things I've kind of noticed in this listening work is that we think sometimes the message is where, if there's miscommunication or misalignment, we blame the message. If we'd said it better, it would have been fine, right? And I think what it misses is the huge part of that cognitive bias, and what is happening to people when they hear that message, and who's going to hear it conceptually, who's going to hear it reflectively, connectively, or concept, or whatever I missed, analytically, sorry. But knowing that, changes how that whole conversation potentially goes. And I think it does allow people to ask better questions, to kind of fill in their own gaps, so that we do all walk out with a much clearer understanding of what is my role in this, and what is the impact on the team, and what is the data, or the, not even the data, but the sort of the proof that this is the right call, right? Like, what is that tells us we're headed in the right direction? That's that kind of analytic side. So I am starting, the more and more I talk about the work, the more I see how it can apply both as an add-in, but also as kind of like a fundamental for individuals. For teams, yes, absolutely. But to your point, I think for individuals, when we talk about goals at the individual level, this is where I think it can be really impactful. If I'm having a one-on-one with someone and I don't understand how they're listening to my words, right? They're gonna miss some of what I want them to take away. It's just likely to happen. But if I understand they're coming at it from one of those four, then I can ask different questions to ensure they're hearing my whole sort of message about how they're contributing to the team, how they're bringing in their own experience. And I think it really can just enrich those one-on-one experiences. And we know that that is what leaders need to, like I say, need to be doing more, with the full recognition that that's where leaders are really taxed with. How do I find the time for a one-on-one? How do I find the time for that 30 minutes that people need? And so if we have to figure out how to do this hard thing anyway, what if we could be more efficient because we've got a better understanding of how to make it a well-rounded conversation the quickest?
So important, right? Gallup's work, right? Their research came back to say the thing that makes the biggest impact on employee engagement is that one meaningful conversation every week with every employee. And if you don't understand your team, if you don't understand the folks on your team of how they like to approach things, be it from a listening standpoint, a communication standpoint, of how they like to execute on work or build relationships, if you don't have that understanding, how could you ever have a meaningful conversation with everybody all the time?
Yeah, you can't. I mean, I think being able to meet people where they are means you know them. Like, you can't meet people where they are if you don't know where they are. And that comes from creating an environment that allows you to get to that information.
So if a team is going to do something like this, so I have not done the listening intelligence assessment. So now I will be doing that when we hang up today. Right. So if a team is going to do this, what people always ask me, like, what strengths, like, how much time does it take for us to
Mm,
really build a strengths based team? And I'm like, listen, the assessment, half hour, like intro workshop, 3 to 6 hours. Everything after that, if you just do that, it was a fun team building day. It
mhm.
doesn't actually impact it.
Yep.
So I know whenever I'm working with a leader, they want to know, like, what's this investment? So if somebody decided they're going to do this with their team, right? I'm going to have my team do this listening assessment. How much time do you think it take
Mhm.
for people to get kind of a basic understanding and be able to start seeing the impact of it quickly?
Yeah, no, I love that question because my experience with it is that it is remarkably fast. Because one, the assessment itself is like 10 minutes. So that's quick. And then the way the report is structured, it's just very clear in terms of, like, this is the superpower of listening to the world this way. This is your blind spot of listening to the world this way. And it just provides it in language that everybody can kind of latch onto and go, okay, yeah, I get that. And then I think when we layer it in with this idea of what are some of the questions you're both listening for, because that tells you a bit about the other person, but also what are the questions you want to come to a conversation with in order to get your listening needs met, that becomes a really easy uptake, right? Like, I can have a short list of a couple of things and they can be my go to. So if I'm going into one on ones, I can always have very similar, three questions I ask for the three buckets that aren't my kind of primary listening mode. And so I think it becomes actionable really fast, which is what I've started. The more I've worked with it, that's the part I've liked. Is it just feels actionable quickly once you understand the four and you understand a few questions that fall into that four. Like, you're kind of off to the races. And then if you do some of your own integration, either in meetings or in one-on-ones, it does very quickly become this thing that you can integrate almost kind of effortlessly, because you don't have to be perfect at it. All we're trying to do is improve the balance and not be potentially so super dominant on one that you miss everything else. So we're just looking for a little bit of intention and you're better off, right? So the measure is it's kind of a low bar in a good way.
So, as you're talking about this, the other application I can think about here is on job interviews,
Oh yeah.
right? So, a lot of the folks listening to this are listening to this podcast. A lot of our listeners are listening because they are interested in squiggling their career, right? They're interested in doing something different,
Yep.
which often means job interviews. And, boy, if you could go into a job interview and really listen, really understand that job, what that manager wants, how to answer the questions,
Mhm.
what a difference that would make.
Yes. So it's funny. I'm laughing because I literally just recorded a little kind of series around listening intelligence, and one of the interviews I did was around interviewing. So I will share it if you want it to make it available. But
Oh, excellent. Yeah, we'll definitely link that in the show notes.
what I really appreciated about the conversation that he and I had is he's able to see it from both sides. So to your point, there's a huge benefit to someone who's being interviewed at being able to have just some like almost like the clues to talent language, but like clues to listening, right? So if someone's asking you certain kinds of questions, that is kind of a giveaway for the type of listener they probably are. And so what we know is that, for instance, an analytic listener, if you don't satisfy that analytic need, typically they're kind of out. They're still there, but they're not engaged at the level you want them to be. So you as an interviewee want to be listening for who on that panel is likely an analytic listener, because I need to hit that first, because I need them to stay in the conversation. I need them to be part of it all the way to the end. And if I wait till the end for the analytics, they're out. And analytic is unique in that way. Like that's one where you really have to hit that first. So it allows you to be a little strategic in your answer, because you're not going to know who's on the panel and you're not going to know what their listening styles are. But if you're strategic in your answer through this listening lens, you can kind of make sure everybody got what they needed out of your answer in order to be like, okay, yeah, they know what they're talking about. They're a good candidate. The flip of that is if you're on a panel and you are part of a panel, like think about what the impact is if that panel is all conceptual people, right? Nobody's asking about your role. No, yeah, I mean, they will, but you know what I'm saying? Like they're not listening for your contribution, how the team did as much. They're listening for like big ideas, big possibilities, future thinking. That's for them, that makes you a really like top tier candidate, because that's what energizes them. And so we store what we hear in our body. And so it is that idea that even though nobody's saying that, when you walk out of an interview, you have an impression about someone, and it is not always just about what they said. Sometimes it's about like that feeling that was evoked that you can't quite put your finger on, and maybe that's a little bit tied to how you listen. And so it's also good for, I think, for organizations to think about like, are we conscious in how we design those panels so that we get the full candidate perspective? We're able to hear all things about this candidate, not just one of these four aspects.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
It has so many applications. And for those of you who are interviewing, what a great concept to be aware of.
Yeah. And simple, like to your earlier point, I think the value is in the simplicity, because I love strengths. Like I will I will love strengths forever. And it is like yoga, right? It is this iterative process that we have to continue to kind of work on and strengthen to get really good at spotting our strengths kind of out in the wild. And I feel like because listening is really just these four, it's a little bit more streamlined. It's a little bit quicker uptake. They have very different values. One is listening, and one is more about kind of how you're showing up in the world. So there's value in both, but I feel like it's a quick win, which I think is always nice when we're trying to further our growth and development, but maybe we don't have a lot of time or a lot of money.
I love that. And I love it's the ability, right? This is something that can be used for job seekers, or I think about the implications of that when you're doing an internship,
Oh
right?
yeah.
And that ability to go in and to understand your listening style and understand other people's listening style. You'll get so much more out of your internship than if you
Yeah.
didn't know that.
Yeah. I was talking to someone recently who had a high analytic, and she, talked about that and the idea that she would go into meetings and start questioning because she's wanting to hear the sort of the facts and the figures and the data. And the perception then was that she didn't sort of trust people. So there's these like second order effects of these tendencies that we have. And if we can put some language to that, then it just helps us be more aware, which I think is, that's part of what's important about it.
Such a great tool. And I think for most people who are listening today, probably a new one to add to their bucket. So we will definitely link the tool. We'll link your company, your info in our show notes for folks. And also that interview that you said the
Yeah.
conversation you had around interviews, I think will be really kind of helpful for the folks listening today.
Yeah. Sounds great.
All right, Jen, we always end with our kind of rapid fire questions. So since you're here, you're in the hot seat. Let's go through some of these. All right, my first one. Are you a heels or a sneakers kind of person?
Oh, gosh. Yeah, I'm not heels, so I'll say sneakers, but if there's something in between, that would be me.
Excellent. What do you bring into the potluck when we invite you over?
Ooh. If I have all the time in the world, I am bringing butternut squash or bacon wrapped butternut squash. It is a party favorite.
Ooh, I think I'm going to need the recipe for that one. Um, excellent. What is a book that you recommend for folks, fiction or nonfiction? Like what do you think folks need to read?
Oh gosh. I think it probably depends on their intent, what their goal is at the moment. I love things around kind of psychology and that space. So I have a lot on my Audible that is sort of psychology based. But if I think about it from a professional perspective, I'll go with that instead. One of my favorites is multipliers.
Mm,
And
yep.
multipliers or impact players, there's some similarity, but there's a little bit different intent behind each of them. But I love multipliers because it really, I think, helps say the quiet parts out loud in terms of how you can be an amplifier for people or how you can accidentally really kind of squash the creativity and the value and just the brilliance that people can bring to the table, and you do it in ways that you don't even know you're doing. So I think it can be eye-opening for a lot of folks that may accidentally struggle with that.
Yeah, right. What an important concept and book for leaders to read, right? Everybody, but
Yes.
particularly leaders.
Yeah. No, I love
So,
it.
well, thanks so much for our conversation today, Jen. This was great. I'm excited that you're going to be on monthly. And so
Mhm.
we'll be talking every month, bringing in some other great guests to talk about and kind of have some more great conversations with. If folks want to find you, where can they find you out in the world, right? If they want to follow you or,
Yep. So I am pretty much on LinkedIn only. So on LinkedIn under Jennifer Pasquale, and then Lead with Curiosity. And our website is leadwithcuriosity.co. So those are kind of the best places to find what we're up to.
excellent. Well, thanks so much for joining me today. This has been a fantastic conversation, and I look forward to the rest of them this year.
Yep, I'm excited. I'm sure I'm going to learn. I hope I can contribute, but I know I'll learn too, which is always great.
Is it time for you to add a little squiggle to your career? Join us every week to hear from another guest talk about how they embrace the squiggle.
Subscribe now and find your inspiration.